There is a strange reason why fairy tales have survived for centuries. They were never meant only for children. Behind the kings, forests, animals, and magical creatures lies something far more ancient, a symbolic language that speaks directly to the human soul. Long before modern psychology existed, these stories were already describing the hidden movements of the psyche. This is precisely what fascinated the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. Jung believed that myths and fairy tales are not random fantasies, but living maps of the unconscious. They reveal the invisible forces that shape our fears, our transformations, and the mysterious process of becoming who we truly are. One of Jung's closest collaborators, the brilliant analyst Marie-Louise von Franz, dedicated much of her life to studying these symbolic stories. She discovered that fairy tales often describe psychological events that every human being eventually faces: loss, exile, collapse, and renewal. But these stories rarely speak in the language of comfort. They speak in the language of transformation. In the Jungian view, the psyche grows the way nature grows, through cycles of destruction and rebirth. Something old must end before something deeper can emerge. And many of the most powerful symbols in myth point directly to this painful, mysterious process. One of the most striking images of this transformation appears in the ancient myth of the phoenix, a magnificent creature that does not simply change, it burns, and from its own ashes, it is born again. Most people imagine spiritual growth as a gentle journey of healing and self-love, but the psychological reality described by von Franz is far more unsettling. True transformation often begins when the identity we carefully built throughout life begins to collapse. The structures of the ego crack, the certainties disappear, and the person we thought we were begins to dissolve. In this video, we will explore the deeper psychological meaning of the phoenix through the lens of Jungian psychology and the insights of Marie-Louise von Franz. Because the phoenix is not only a myth, it is a portrait of a process that can unfold inside any human life. And the real question is this: if transformation demands that the old self burn completely, would you have the courage to step into the fire? There are moments in life when something inside us begins to break. Not dramatically at first, not with flames and thunder. It begins quietly. A strange dissatisfaction appears where certainty once lived. The roles we once carried with confidence, professional, partner, parent, achiever, start to feel strangely hollow. The life that once seemed stable begins to feel misaligned. From the outside, nothing may seem wrong, but inside, a subtle heat begins to rise. Many people interpret this moment as failure, a midlife crisis, burnout, depression, something that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible so life can return to the way it was before. But from a psychological perspective inspired by Carl Jung, something much deeper may be happening. The psyche itself may be entering a transformative process. Jung observed that the human personality is not a static structure, it is alive, and like any living system, it periodically reorganizes itself. When the ego, the part of us that manages our identity and our place in the world, becomes too rigid, the deeper layers of the psyche begin to push back. At first, this pressure feels like confusion. Old ambitions lose their meaning. Certain relationships no longer feel authentic. The future that once seemed clear now looks strangely empty. This is the moment when many people desperately try to restore control. They double down on the old identity, work harder, hold tighter, try to force life back into its familiar shape. But the psyche rarely allows this for long, because what is beginning to burn is not merely a phase of life. It is the structure of the self we have built around survival, expectations, and adaptation. The stories studied by Marie-Louise von Franz often describe this moment symbolically. A kingdom falls into disorder. A hero loses everything. A mysterious fire appears where life once felt safe. These images are not exaggerations. They are psychological truths. Before renewal can happen, something old must lose its power. And this rarely feels graceful. It feels like disorientation, loss, and sometimes even psychological collapse. But beneath this destruction, another movement quietly begins. Because when the psyche starts to burn, it may be preparing the ground for a rebirth the ego never planned. When most people think of the phoenix, they imagine something inspiring. A radiant bird rising gracefully from the ashes, a symbol of hope, renewal, and spiritual awakening. The image often appears in books, motivational speeches, and modern spirituality as a comforting metaphor. No matter how difficult life becomes, you will rise again, stronger and wiser. But psychologically, this interpretation hides something essential. The phoenix is not a gentle symbol. In its original mythic form, the phoenix does not simply recover from destruction. It deliberately enters the fire. The creature builds its own funeral pyre and allows itself to be consumed by flames. Only after total incineration does the possibility of rebirth emerge. Nothing survives the fire. This detail is crucial, because from a psychological perspective, the myth is not describing recovery from difficulty. It is describing a process of radical transformation in which the existing identity must be completely undone. This is precisely the kind of symbolic process that fascinated the work of Carl Jung. Jung observed that the deepest transformations of the psyche rarely occur through gradual improvement. More often, they begin with a breakdown of the structures that once gave life its stability and meaning. The ego, the part of us that organizes our sense of identity, resists this kind of change. It prefers continuity, control, predictable growth, but the unconscious does not follow the same logic. When the psyche reaches a point where the old identity can no longer support the deeper movement of life, a kind of psychological combustion begins. The beliefs, ambitions, and self-images that once defined us begin to crack under pressure, and this rarely feels uplifting. It feels like loss. The French psychoanalyst and Jungian scholar Marie-Louise von Franz repeatedly emphasized that myths and fairy tales often portray transformation through destruction rather than improvement. A castle collapses, a kingdom falls into darkness, a hero must wander through a forest of uncertainty before anything new can emerge. These images are not meant to comfort us. They describe the psychological truth that real transformation requires the death of something that once felt essential. This is why the phoenix myth is so unsettling when we look at it honestly. The bird does not negotiate with the fire. It does not attempt to escape the flames once the burning begins. It accepts the total dissolution of its previous form. Only ash remains. From the perspective of the ego, this stage looks like catastrophe, a loss of direction, a collapse of identity, the terrifying sense that the person we once were no longer exists. But symbolically, the ash represents something very specific. It is the moment when the psyche has stripped away everything that is no longer alive. No illusions, no borrowed identities, no structures maintained only by habit or fear, just the essential material from which something new can eventually take shape. Seen this way, the phoenix is not merely a symbol of rebirth. It is a symbol of the brutal honesty required for transformation. Because before we can become someone new, the self we once believed we were must be willing to burn completely. For many people, the idea that psychological growth requires destruction sounds disturbing. We are taught to improve ourselves, refine our personality, and gradually become a better version of who we already are. The assumption is simple. Growth means building something stronger on top of what already exists. But the deeper psychology explored by Marie-Louise von Franz reveals a very different pattern. Again and again, when she analyzed fairy tales, myths, and dreams, she encountered the same symbolic structure. Before something new can emerge in the psyche, the existing order must first collapse. The old structure does not simply evolve, it disintegrates. This is what she often referred to as a necessary destruction. In Jungian psychology, the ego plays a crucial role in helping us adapt to the world. It organizes our identity, our goals, our relationships, and the narrative we tell about our lives. In many ways, the ego is the architect of the personality we present to the world. But over time, this structure can become rigid. The identity that once helped us survive childhood, navigate social expectations, or achieve success in adulthood may slowly lose its vitality. What once felt authentic becomes mechanical. The roles we inhabit begin to feel strangely foreign, as if we are performing a life rather than living it. According to the psychological perspective first articulated by Carl Jung, this tension signals the beginning of a deeper movement within the psyche. Something larger than the ego begins to push for transformation. Yet the ego rarely welcomes this change. It resists the collapse of its own structure. It tries to hold everything together: the identity, the ambitions, the familiar patterns that once gave life a sense of order. But the psyche has its own logic, and when the pressure for transformation becomes strong enough, the old system begins to crack. Von Franz observed that fairy tales portray this moment with striking clarity. A king falls ill and the kingdom descends into chaos. A hero is cast out of his home. A heroine loses her status and must wander through darkness and uncertainty. These events symbolize the same psychological truth. The center that once governed the personality has lost its authority. To the conscious mind, this feels like failure. But symbolically, it is the beginning of reorganization. Because the deeper goal of the psyche is not to preserve the ego's stability, its goal is to move the individual toward a more authentic alignment with the deeper center of the personality, what Jung called the self. And reaching that center often requires the dismantling of the life we built before we knew who we truly were. In this sense, the destruction symbolized by the phoenix's fire is not cruelty. It is the psyche clearing space for a life that has not yet been born. If the fire of transformation represents the destruction of the old identity, then the ashes represent something far more difficult to endure. The in-between, the moment when the former self has already collapsed, but the new self has not yet appeared. In myth, this stage is rarely described with triumph. It is described with silence, darkness, and waiting. The burning has ended, but what remains looks like nothing more than gray dust. Psychologically, this corresponds to one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can face. The ego, which once provided a clear sense of identity, direction, and control, has lost its authority. The ambitions that once drove us forward no longer carry the same energy. The goals that once defined our life suddenly feel strangely empty. People often describe this period as feeling lost, not in the dramatic sense of chaos, but in a quieter and more unsettling way. It can feel like standing in the middle of your own life and realizing that the person who built it no longer fully exists. In the symbolic language explored by Carl Jung, this stage marks the weakening of the ego's dominance over the psyche. The personality is no longer organized around the same familiar structures. Something deeper has begun to move beneath the surface. But this deeper movement is not immediately visible. That is why the image of ash is so psychologically precise. Ash is what remains after the fire has removed everything that could burn. All that is left is the most basic material, stripped of form, stripped of identity, stripped of the structures that once gave it shape. This stage can feel profoundly uncomfortable because the ego experiences it as emptiness. There may be uncertainty about the future, confusion about personal desires, a sense that the old motivations no longer function while the new ones have not yet revealed themselves. In her work with myths and fairy tales, Marie-Louise von Franz often emphasized that this stage should not be rushed. The psyche, like nature, moves in cycles that cannot be forced. Just as winter prepares the soil for spring, the ashes prepare the ground for a new psychological structure to emerge. But the ego rarely trusts this process. It wants immediate clarity, immediate rebirth, immediate meaning. Yet the deeper transformation symbolized by the phoenix requires something more difficult than action. It requires patience with the unknown, because the ashes of the ego are not the end of the story. They are the quiet moment in which the psyche begins, slowly and invisibly, to reorganize itself around something more authentic than the identity that burned before. If the ashes represent the dissolution of the old identity, then the next stage of the process is something far more mysterious. Because rebirth does not happen when the ego decides it is ready. It happens when the psyche itself begins to reorganize. This is one of the most important insights found in the psychological work of Carl Jung. Jung observed that the deepest transformations in human life do not come from conscious control alone. They emerge from a deeper center of the psyche, a regulating principle that moves the personality toward greater wholeness. He called this center the self, but the self does not operate according to the ego's preferences. It does not ask whether the timing feels comfortable. It does not consult the plans we carefully built for our lives. Instead, it works through a process that often appears chaotic, even violent, from the perspective of the conscious mind. The old identity collapses. The familiar structures dissolve. The person we thought we were disappears into uncertainty. And for a time, it seems as if nothing meaningful can grow from the ruins. Yet beneath the surface, something extraordinary begins to take shape. Just as the mythic phoenix slowly reforms from the ashes, the psyche begins to generate a new center of orientation. But this new identity is not simply a repaired version of the old one. It is different. The ambitions may change. The values may shift. The relationships that once defined us may lose their central place in life. In many fairy tales studied by Marie-Louise von Franz, this moment is symbolized by the appearance of something unexpected. A hidden helper, a mysterious guide, a forgotten treasure that suddenly emerges after the hero has endured the darkest stage of the journey. These symbols represent the same psychological truth. When the ego relinquishes its rigid control, deeper forces within the psyche begin to participate in shaping life. This is why rebirth is not merely a pleasant renewal. It is a violent grace. Violent because the transformation requires the destruction of the structures that once gave the ego its sense of security. Graceful because the new life that emerges is not something we manufactured through effort alone. It arises from a deeper intelligence within the psyche, one that has been guiding the process from the beginning. Seen this way, the rebirth of the phoenix is not a reward for surviving the fire. It is the natural consequence of allowing the old self to burn completely. Because only when the ashes are honest can the psyche begin to shape a life that is truly alive. At first glance, the myth of the phoenix raises an unsettling question. Why would any living creature willingly enter the fire? Why would the psyche choose a path that involves collapse, loss, and the painful dismantling of identity? From the perspective of the ego, this makes no sense. The ego seeks stability. It wants to preserve what it has built, the career, the relationships, the identity that provides a sense of place in the world. Its instinct is to avoid disruption and protect continuity. But the deeper layers of the psyche operate according to a very different principle. In the psychological vision of Carl Jung, the human personality is not designed simply to remain stable. It is designed to evolve toward wholeness. Jung believed that within every person, there exists a deeper organizing center of the psyche, a guiding force that quietly pushes life toward greater psychological integration. Yet this movement toward wholeness often requires the dismantling of identities that once served us well. A life structure that helped us adapt in our 20s may feel suffocating in our 40s. The ambitions that once gave us purpose may gradually lose their vitality as deeper questions begin to surface. Who am I beyond the roles I have played? What part of my life was shaped by expectation rather than truth? What parts of myself have remained hidden or ignored? When these questions begin to emerge, the psyche enters a state of tension. Something within us senses that the current structure of life can no longer contain the deeper potential that is trying to unfold. This is when the symbolic fire appears. The fire does not represent punishment. It represents pressure for transformation. In many of the fairy tales analyzed by Marie-Louise von Franz, the hero or heroine does not initially choose the ordeal. They are pushed into it by circumstances, exile, betrayal, loss, or sudden upheaval. Yet symbolically, these events represent the psyche forcing the individual to leave a life that has become too small for the soul's deeper development. The fire strips away illusions. It burns through the identities we adopted to gain approval, security, or belonging. It exposes the fragile structures we built to avoid uncertainty. And in doing so, it reveals something far more authentic beneath the surface. This is why the Phoenix myth continues to resonate so powerfully across cultures and centuries. Because every human life eventually encounters moments when the soul demands transformation. Not improvement, but metamorphosis. And when that moment arrives, the real challenge is not how to avoid the fire. It is whether we are willing to trust that the flames are clearing the path for a life that could not exist before the burning began. At some point in life, almost everyone encounters a moment when the ground beneath their identity begins to shift. It may arrive quietly, a growing sense that the life you carefully built no longer feels fully yours. The ambitions that once drove you forward begin to lose their energy. The roles you once carried with pride start to feel strangely distant, as if they belong to someone you used to be, or the change may arrive violently. A loss, a betrayal, a collapse of something you believed would always remain stable. In those moments, it can feel as if life itself has turned against you, as if something precious has been taken away with no explanation. But from the symbolic perspective explored by Carl Jung, and later deepened by Marie-Louise von Franz, these moments often carry a deeper meaning. They are not merely interruptions in the story of our lives. They are turning points in the evolution of the psyche. The myth of the phoenix survives across centuries and cultures because it describes something profoundly human. Not a fantasy creature in a distant world, but a psychological pattern that unfolds inside real lives. The phoenix burns not because it is weak. It burns because its current form can no longer contain the life that is trying to emerge. And in many ways, the same is true for us. There are stages of life where the identity we built, the beliefs, ambitions, and expectations that once gave us direction, becomes too small for the deeper movement of the soul. What once protected us begins to confine us. When this happens, the psyche begins its mysterious work. Old certainties dissolve. Familiar structures collapse. The person we believed ourselves to be slowly turns to ash. Yet hidden inside this destruction is something quietly preparing to be born. A new orientation. A deeper honesty about who we are. A life less organized around expectation and more aligned with inner truth. This is why the image of the phoenix continues to live inside the human imagination. Because somewhere within every person exists the same possibility, the capacity to endure the burning of an old identity and allow something more authentic to rise from the ashes. And perhaps the real question is not whether the phoenix lives in you. The real question is this: when the fire comes, will you resist it or will you allow it to transform you? Sometimes I wonder if the moments in my life that felt like collapse were actually the beginning of something deeper trying to emerge. And that leads me to a question I can't ignore. When parts of my identity begin to crack, when the life I built starts to feel like ash in my hands, do I immediately try to rebuild the same person I was? Or do I have the courage to ask what within me is asking to be reborn? Maybe the real tension we explored today is this: am I protecting the identity that keeps me comfortable? Or am I willing to face the fire that might reveal who I truly am? If this reflection resonated with you, let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear what part of this journey spoke most deeply to you. And if you're interested in exploring more of these hidden psychological meanings within myths and fairy tales, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we explore the deeper ideas of Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz, to uncover the symbolic stories that still shape the human soul today. Thank you for being here and for taking the time to reflect on these deeper questions with me. I look forward to seeing you in the next videos. Until then, take care and keep listening to the quiet movements of your inner world.